signal also thread, thus enabling folks to only with injure and apprehension place a finger against only the hopes that a commandeering of digital transmission could emit, while allowing for an assessing just the same unto a sense of just where the beleaguered world might be spiraling to next. The prevailing hushed question long since felt as an impaled shush presiding storm, and during an hour when self-appointed one steered from the helm in some form of civilization's crashed borders derby, precisely at what point would this heavily anticipated Messiah return? Shushed in a post-rapture world without a sense of altogether abandoning a hope or dread for a sole difference maker somehow. The Islamicist folk welcomed in their peacemaker, but only unto the mechanics of Abaddon and Apollyon had the world as embodiment of imperiled inelasticity segued. And, as was America's, for much of the national horrors elsewhere, how is it that there was an expansive yearning to still the hands of some time clock somewhere and in some fashion to reveal such an impossible intervention? Such was still entrusted to the keepers of the books, inside of which was compartmentalized the prophetic writings that surname was civilization's hourglass that had long since tipped Israel with commanding victories, even following an enacted former imposed two-state plan solution, verily long since redesigning expectations around life only, while consisting as might the mighty Maccabees in terms of manner of daily life. The clear distinction in the organized force and valiant form of consisting as Israeli forces pressed in with the Jerusalem of the nations against odds quintuple seen, with miracle working unseen helps from heaven's fort, warehousing odds defying exploits still. The threat such as this one delivered to America, delivered there against very Jerusalem, which was scarcely at this late juncture the quantifiable surprise overtaking all any pretensions in Tehran long since over, as was the immediate presence of troops of Israel's neighbors who were closest in proximity, yet because of what had transpired were they as recruited ones into other armies now. That is to say, the Nasser Abu Matta Hussein Confederation of Islamic Nations, who hopes largely impinge on the welfare of the more sizable nations and armies preceding his very arrival on earth terra firma. Still the forces of the far north and east had formed their offensives that they might accomplish what said neighbors couldn't pull off. 3 years after the Troy horse abomination of desolation event had occurred, which meant that a sizable portion of Earth's population had lightened planet Earth's weight, some with only 1 year from the hour at hand, and with their removal 'twas truly only then that the age-old adage has a sense of ringing true to the type left as dubious caretakers of the planet, the saying positing that verily victory did only belong to the fittest, only if the ideal of survival hadn't pinned its hope idea and impossible domination still. 'Twas only the sense that man's woes on mankind were approaching a corset bulging, constraining, resulting in the retiring of Earth's vacancy signs in every place. Question remained, in a post-democratic world, what would the day of the Lord's vengeance woes result in? The prophet Zechariah in his manifold declarations of the Lord spoke of the latter and last days characteristic that was good news only where a hurdling of quite the travesty in her land was inevitable as precursor. And elsewhere prophecies spoke to the conditions that our traveling sojourn here had with specificity expounded upon, the both retaliatory and fiendish defensive terrorist shield response transmuting to the afflictions of Gaza as we've seen. Zephaniah did peer into of Damascus, as Isaiah did foresee, and as retaliation for hit on Tel Aviv. And who could from scriptures empirically foretell this? Also of Iran's proxy wars worn thin and in time squelched by American and Israel alongside ally responses. Ezekiel 38. 39. Iran was a clue to the just travesty, so called as orchestrated by the Lord of hosts. that answers questions generated by Zechariah's grim chapter 14 for a generation no longer questioning what the implied ghastly destruction results from and who is the only one. Perhaps. To form policy around the inability to turn the mind away from the same looming dread. Verily, with some politicians with vested interest hedging their ambitions in accordance to and with mindfulness of most proactively moving to at least minimalize this certain threat. This prophecy, even during the latest of late hours, not unlike the Messiah's return. Not coincidentally, it was still future yet. Albeit as in a time like never before, the very near future. There wasn't a nation with apathy as a national policy any longer, with the death horses of the apocalypse long since cartelling their horsemen into destined position. With the three of them sitting at the table with oversized microphones there atop, the man began. Ad nauseum cartooning in gaudy jest. The Sheikh Mohammed Zare Shariat cleared his throat and began. Quote, my dear Americans and to all who watch. Greetings to you from Crisis Emergency Election Headquarters, only in an undisclosed remote location. As you can guess, the winner of the election is hitherto announced to the world at large. And, of course, yours truly. Religious advisor and at times aide-de-camp of Ambassador Nasser Mata Abu Hussein, who was not even on the ticket, as many of you without doubt must be bewildered to have learned. Saying that it is not he to address you today, but it is me, or I pardon English. As a matter of fact, I asked not for one vote from the American toll booth, yet am I declared as the adjunct winner of the world's most held-out election, resisting the sensible course of our day, while most other nations abroad are sensibly together and united as one.
Context right here. I don't at the end
Either
of
way,
that,
I'm pleased to be your leader.
I missed a paragraph in there.
And so should you be pleased, seeing the time of distress suddenly that you are in under here on your homeland.
These are the later storied destructions that
You
occurred.
required a savior, so here we are as your last stand, quote, quote, surely I hope. Feigning enthused merriment, said a news reporter sarcastically.
Towards the tail end of the story.
With an assistant with
Alright, so I
scarcely
reserved
days
Eli
but
James,
weeks without sleep evident
2023,
in her
today's
eyes.
March 10th, 2024. The production is titled 70. The audio only now started stuttering or going real slow like that, or I would have been able to get done with the entire video. Enjoy what I have there. You can read it with your own eyes.
Yeah.
Good day, good night. 412-683-1294. Email Eli James, non-collaborative.
Briefing rooms back at the Capitol.
Eli James, non-collaborative right, WRITE, at gmail.com. Good day, good night.